Hello. Hi, Malcolm. Thank you for today, and I'll hand
My
over to you. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Right, hello, everybody. Wonderful to see so many people here. We've got more than 330 people in the room so far, and it looks like people are joining every second, so that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you all very much for coming. And you're from all around the world, absolutely brilliant. It's just gone 6 p.m. here, so it's the end of my working day. Looks like for some of you, it's the middle of the night. So whatever time it is, thank you very, very much for coming. Today in this session, we're talking about the future. Now, I'm going to be putting quite a lot of information up on the slides over the next 45 minutes or so. Please don't feel you need to take lots of notes. You really don't. As Federica said, in a couple of days, we'll be sending you an email and you'll get a PDF of all of the slides from this presentation, which you can then share with your colleagues or with your students if you want to, but you don't feel you have to write everything down right now. So talking about the future, one of the things I think is quite interesting about the future is the difference between receptive and productive, between reception and production. In terms of reception, so reading and listening, I think generally our students don't have any problems. There isn't a particularly difficult aspect to this. Whether they encounter, perhaps in a reading text or a listening text, we arrive at 3 p.m., we're arriving at 3 p.m., we're going to arrive at 3 p.m. tomorrow, we will arrive at 3 p.m. tomorrow. Any of those, I don't think our students are going to struggle that this is a sentence about the future. Obviously, we've got here in these examples, the word tomorrow. That's a clue word, a key word. It tells the students it's about the future. So there isn't a real problem in terms of reception. The problem for our students is one of production. When they're speaking, when they're writing, what are they going to choose? Are they going to choose arrive? We're arriving, we're going to arrive, we will arrive, we will be arriving? Or even with the present continuous, the short form or the long form, we're arriving or we are arriving. And with going to, we're going to arrive or we are going to arrive. Or even we're gonna arrive. There are so many choices. And this is the problem for our students. Which one are they going to choose? And I think the problem from our perspective as teachers, how are we going to help them make the right decision? How are we going to get them to say something that sounds natural and fluent? That's what we're going to be thinking about today. If your students came to you and said, when do we use will and when do we use be going to? Would you find it easy or difficult to explain the difference between will and be going to your students? Just write easy or difficult in the chat box. Easy, quite easy. Most people saying easy. That's very interesting. One person said difficult, right, 2 or 3 people saying difficult. I'm very, very glad you find it easy. Personally, I find it quite difficult. So could you, now I know there's lots of different aspects to will versus be going to. Which is the key one? Which is the first one that you would point out to your students? Very briefly, type into the chat box what you would explain is the key difference between will and be going to. And let's have a look. Okay, planning, duration, going to his intentions, interesting. Be going to his intention, predictions, planned or unplanned, very interesting. When the decision is made, very interesting. Decision at the moment of speaking. Will is prediction. Right, these are all very, very interesting. Will is suddenly no intention, going to is intention. Will is action at once, be going to is planning. On the spot decisions is will. Okay, we've got some really, really good ideas there. Let's stop typing now. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to explore some of these over the next 40 minutes or so. But actually, I want to start with a very, very specific grammatical structure, the first conditional. Now, when we teach the first conditional to our students, we tend to spend a lot of time making sure our students understand that we don't use will in the if clause. So we say, for example, if you see Adam later, tell him to call me. We don't say in English, if you will see Adam later. And then at higher levels, perhaps B2 or above, we might introduce some exceptions to that. So we might say, actually, on occasion for emphasis, we might use will. So, well, if you will keep staying up late, no wonder you're tired. Or in a very formal, polite situation, if you'll just follow me, I'll show you to your room. But on the whole, we don't use will in the if clause of a first conditional. What's interesting is that we can use be going to. If you're going to see Adam later, or if you're going to see Adam later, tell him to call me. Now, I'm mentioning this here for two main reasons. Firstly, because I think it's interesting and a shame that many course books and many grammar books don't mention this. When they introduce the first conditional, they don't mention that unlike will, we can use be going to in the if clause of a first conditional. And I think that's a shame because it's very, very common in English. We use this all the time. So it's rather strange that grammar books and course books often miss it out. And similarly with the second conditional, if you were to go to live on Mars, what would you take with you? It's very, very common to use be going to in the simple past form in the second conditional, but we tend to ignore it. And that's a shame. The other reason I mention it is because I think it tells us something very interesting about the difference between be going to and will. Because be going to is fundamentally a specific form of the present continuous. We don't only use present simple, of course, in the if clause of the first conditional. We can also use present continuous. We can also use present perfect. So we can say things like, if you're seeing Adam later, tell him to call me. And we teach that to our students. So it would actually be surprising if we couldn't use be going to, because be going to is a specific form of the present continuous. It isn't this thing on its own. It's actually one kind, one type of the present continuous. And so in one sense, it's rooted in the now. And also, I think, what it does, it suggests you've already started on a journey, on a metaphorical journey to achieve something. So I'm planning to cook pasta tonight. You've already started on that journey. That's not me doing that. Sorry, we've got a problem with the slides. I'm just going back. There we are. I'm planning to cook pasta tonight. You've already started on that journey by planning. So we can say, I'm going to cook pasta tonight. Dana is intending to be a doctor when she's older. She's already started on that journey by thinking about it. So we can say Dana is going to be a doctor when she's older. It's looking like it will rain. The weather has already started on that journey towards raining. So we can say it's going to rain. And I think that's a fundamental difference. We've already started on the metaphorical journey that's inherent in be going to, but isn't inherent in the word will. Now, let's think about how we think about talking about the future in many grammar books and course books. What they say the student should do often is, first of all, determine the function. So, for example, is it a decision made at the moment of speaking, or is it a decision or plan made before the moment of speaking? And when the student has determined the function, then there's no choice. If it's a decision made at the moment of speaking, the book says the student should use will. Or if it's a plan or a decision made before the moment of speaking, the student should use be going to. That's how it's often presented in course books and grammar books. And so we get this kind of grammar presentation. We have use will for, and then a number of different things, different bullet points. So decisions made at the moment of speaking, predictions not based on present evidence. And we have use be going to for things like intentions, plans, predictions based on present evidence. Now, one of the things that it sometimes says we use will for is future facts. Now, that's, I think, actually a slightly problematic term. And so later on in this session, I want to come back to the idea of future facts and see what it means in practice. But we'll use that terminology for now and think about it a little bit later. One of the problems, though, there are advantages to having that kind of list. What that list does is it gives our students clear rules, clear guidelines. And for an area such as talking about the future, I think that can be really helpful. And not just for the students, also for the teacher. I remember when I first started teaching, if you gave me a sentence with will or be going to, or the present continuous or the present simple or future perfect or whatever it was, I could tell you if it was right or not, but there was no way I was able to come up with the reason why. I had no idea of what the rules were. So the rules in the course book or the grammar book weren't just useful for the students, they were extremely useful for me. So there are lots of advantages to having rules like that in the grammar presentation in the course book or the grammar book. But one of the disadvantages of those kind of rules where it says use will for these things, use be going to for these different things, is that it isn't difficult to come up with exceptions. And I've faced this situation in the classroom where we've done the grammar presentation, we've done the exercises based on the grammar presentation, and then we've done a reading text. And a bright student puts their hand up and says, you remember that in the grammar rules yesterday, we said use be going to for a prediction based on present evidence? Yes, absolutely. Well, then why in the reading text that we've just done do we have this sentence? It looks like the situation will deteriorate further over the next 100 years or so. That's using will, but isn't that a prediction based on present evidence? And frankly, I had no way of answering that question because one, this sentence looks perfectly correct to me and it's in the reading text, so it is correct, but it's using will and it does seem to be a prediction based on present evidence. So it's possible that the rules don't always tell the full story. Perhaps they are inaccurate or perhaps they are incomplete. And as I say, it's not difficult to come up with sentences that to a certain extent or in one way or another don't seem to fit in with those main rules of use will for this, use be going to for something completely different. So I can imagine someone saying, I know, I'm going to get Dad a jumper for Christmas. And in some senses, that seems to be a decision made at the moment of speaking. They hadn't decided 5 minutes ago, and yet it's using be going to. So that's a little bit odd. I can imagine perhaps somebody saying, I think that one day we're going to discover, or we're going to discover, that the world is actually flat. Now that seems to be a prediction not based on present evidence. There is no evidence that the world is actually flat, quite the contrary. And yet it's using be going to, it's not using will. So once again, in some senses, that seems to contradict the rules. The election is going to be held next April. Now that seems to me perfectly grammatically correct. But I would also argue if future fact means anything, And we will come back to the idea of future facts, because I think future facts are problematic. But if future fact means anything, one could argue that that is a fact about the future. So it seems perfectly acceptable to me grammatically, and yet once again it's using be going to and not using will, which is potentially very confusing for our students. We'll definitely visit the British Museum while we're in London. Now that seems to be something you're not just deciding on the spot at the moment of speaking. It seems to be, in some sense at least, a plan that you've already made, a plan made before the moment of speaking. And yet it uses will. So once again, in some senses, perhaps that contradicts the rules that we generally give our students. You'll fall if you're not careful. Now that seems to be a prediction based on present evidence. Now, of course, there's an if in there, which may change everything, but it's using will. And we tend to tell our students that if it's a prediction based on present evidence, don't use will, use be going to. So in some senses, once again, that is contradicting the rules that we often give our students. So what can we do about that? Well, the first thing we can do, I think, is go to the corpora, these enormous databases of spoken and written English, real examples of how real people in real situations speak and write English. And we can look at examples of how they talk about the future, when they use the present simple, when they use be going to, when they use will. And we can see from those examples whether they match the standard traditional rules that often appear in course books. And I think a corpus-based model shows us a few quite interesting things. First of all, it shows us that often it isn't mutually exclusive in terms of function. Once you've chosen the function, it isn't always true that there is no choice. Sometimes there is a choice. And the choice that the student has to make once the function has been determined is in fact often a real choice. Our students can make a choice sometimes even after the function has been determined. And the difference sometimes between, say, will and be going to is often not a matter of function at all. It's something else. There's something else going on. And that something else that's going on might be formality or emphasis, or on occasion, sentence or grammar structure. So it isn't the case that function is the solely important thing. Now, what we're going to do, even though I've just said it isn't the case that function is the solely important thing, we're actually now going to look at lots of different functions, because it's certainly true that we use will, be going to, present continuous, present simple, etc., for lots of different reasons, for lots of different functions, to express lots of different things. And I'm going to start with what I've already said is a problematic term: future facts, facts about the future. And we will come back a little bit later to explore that in more detail. I'm going to use that terminology for now. Things that seem to be factual but are going to happen in the future. Now, we can use will, and the full form is formal. The 2020 Olympics will be held in Tokyo. So we can imagine that in a formal written text, perhaps a newspaper article or an academic text. In academic texts, it is far more likely to encounter the word will than the phrase be going to. The full form will is fundamentally more formal than the phrase be going to. So we can use the full form will to be formal, and if we want to reduce the level of formality, we can use the short form. The 2020 Olympics will be held in Tokyo. Now that's a little bit difficult to say, to put "ul" after the Olympics, but we do say it. The Olympics will be held in Tokyo. So one thing I really want to stress today in this session is that we should spend a lot more time, perhaps, than we are doing, focusing on encouraging our students when they're speaking, always to use short forms when it's possible to do so. One of the mistakes that students make, particularly in the interview, in the speaking part of exams, is to think, well, this is a formal situation, I've got to be formal, so I'm going to use the full form, whether it's the full form will, or the full form of be going to, I am going to, or the full form of the present continuous, and it just sounds unnatural. So one of the things I'd like to stress today, if we've got limited time in the classroom to focus on the future, I would suggest it's better to spend that time on encouraging our students when they're speaking to use the short form, rather than spend so much time worrying too much about different functions. Having said that, I am going to be thinking about lots of different functions over the next 15 minutes or so. So will, the full form, is inherently formal, and be going to is less formal than will. So they're going to hold the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. Now that's the contracted form already, and we can make that even more informal by not saying going to, by saying gonna. They're gonna hold the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. And once again, I think that's something we should encourage our students to do, to practice using those different forms. For a situation like this, where I'm talking to you in a kind of semi-formal situation, well, it's a kind of formal situation in some senses, but I'm speaking, so that reduces the formality. I'm not sure, but I suspect I would say going to. So in a few minutes, I'm going to do something else. But if I was just chatting to my friends in the pub, I think it's quite likely I'm going to use gonna. There, I just said I'm gonna. So I think our students need to be able to use all of the forms, the full form when they're writing in a formal situation, and the contracted form when they're speaking, and perhaps even gonna when they're just talking to their friends. That's what the skill that they need to live in the real world in the 21st century. So back to this, we can also use present continuous when it's an arrangement. They are holding the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. And of course, once again, there's the contracted form they're holding, which reduces the level of formality. And if the fact concerns a fixed event, a timetabled event, which can't be changed, then we can use the present simple. So the 2020 Olympics are in Tokyo. Predictions. Sorry, I'm just moving my camera so I can read this properly. Based on no present evidence. We can use will, and once again, this is formal. The full form will is always formal. So one day, hamsters will take over the world. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. And be going to is inherently less formal than will. So in a more informal situation, we can use it. One day, hamsters are going to take over the world. But once again, when we're speaking, we're almost certainly going to use the contracted form. Hamsters are, the schwa. Hamsters are going to take over the world. And so I think we need to encourage our students to practice using the short form. But here we can't use the present continuous, and we can't use the present simple. Predictions based on present evidence, we can use will if the prediction expresses conditionality. So if you're not going to if you're not careful, you'll fall. And there it's spoken, so we're much more likely to use the contracted form. We wouldn't use the full form unless it was really for emphasis. So we can use it informally if there's conditionality, and we can use it the full form if we're being formal. So it appears that the UK will suffer from its decision to leave the EU. We're very likely to see that, for example, in a newspaper article, where it's more formal writing or academic writing. Be going to is, as we've said many times now, much less formal than will. So that's why we say, look out, you're going to fall. I think there's two reasons why we say it. One, because we're speaking, and so it's more informal. And secondly, because as we said earlier, there is this immediacy to be going to, which isn't in the word will, because you're already on your metaphorical journey. And so that's why we're much more likely to say, look out, you're going to fall. But what we shouldn't tell our students is that we only use be going to for predictions based on present evidence, because that's not the complete truth. We can also use will for certain circumstances, if it's formal or if the prediction expresses conditionality. We can't use present continuous. So something like, look out, that building's falling down, that isn't about the future. That's describing a situation now rather than predicting the future. And we can't use the present simple. Decisions made at the moment of speaking. We can use will. I know, I'll get Dad a CD for his birthday. And that emphasizes the decision. And this is the one we usually teach. But interestingly, if we really want to emphasize the intention, we can use be going to. And to be honest, there isn't a huge amount of difference. I know I'm going to get Dad a CD for his birthday. What I think's going on here is that when we say a decision made at the moment of speaking, actually, we don't make the decision at the moment of speaking. By the time the words start coming out of our mouth, we've already made the decision. So it's moved from a decision to an intention. And that, I think, is why we can actually, if we want to kind of emphasize the intention, use be going to here. So in lots of grammar books, in lots of course books, what we might have is a multiple choice exercise, 2-option multiple choice, where I'll is the correct answer and I'm going to is the incorrect answer. And in one sense, that's true, but I really wonder whether it's actually worth spending so much time on that. I'd rather spend time, if someone's going to say it, make sure they use the short form, not the long form, because it's the long form that sounds so unnatural. If they choose be going to, but use the short form, really doesn't sound wrong to me. Now, plans, intentions, arrangements decided on before the moment of speaking. There's several different things going on here, plans, intentions, arrangements. We'll unpick them in a second, but I've lumped them all in together for the moment. I do think it's important that our students understand the difference between an intention and an arrangement. Now, I know you all know what the difference is, but how would you explain that to your students? Just type into the chat box how you would explain the difference between an intention and an arrangement. Just give me 1 second. So an intention is what I want to do. Intention is something that you've not accomplished yet. Intention is not fixed. Intention is purely an idea. That's interesting. Arrangement is a plan. Intention is the wish. That's interesting. An arrangement, they've already made plans. Yes, I think that's right. A lot of you are absolutely picking up on explaining the difference between them. I think that's absolutely right. So an intention is a desire or a wish to do something, but it hasn't been planned yet. Whereas an arrangement, the arrangement has already been made. So for example, when I grow up, I want to be an astronaut. That's just a desire or a wish, but you haven't done any planning yet. Whereas I'm studying law because I want to be a lawyer, you've actually done something about it. You've applied for the course. You've got on the course. You've gone to university. So there's a fundamental difference there. Having said that, I do think there is a grey area. So for example, asking for a pay rise tomorrow. Is that an intention or an arrangement? Now, we can say, I'm asking for a pay rise tomorrow. One could argue that that is an intention. You haven't arranged anything with your boss. But in some senses, I think in your head, if you say, I'm asking for a pay rise tomorrow, you've made that arrangement with yourself. You've kind of decided that you're going to go and see your boss. So in some senses, you have arranged some things. So is it an intention? Isn't it an arrangement? I think there is a gray area which complicates things. But fundamentally, the intention is the desire or the wish, but you haven't done anything about it. So to express plans, intentions, and arrangements decided on before the moment of speaking, we can use will, and we had this example earlier. And what I think is going on here is that it's emphasizing the prediction that the intention will be realized. I know that's a bit complicated, but I think that's what's going on. So we'll definitely visit the British Museum. The reason we use will in the short form is because we're speaking, is because there's an element of prediction as well as intention. And we can also use will when we're being formal. The referendum will be held on the 23rd of June. That's an arrangement that's been decided on before the moment of speaking. And we use will because it's formal. We can also use be going to. I'm going to be a writer, or I'm going to be a writer when I'm older. That's an intention. In a second, we'll unpick, again, intentions and arrangements. We can use the present continuous if it's an arrangement rather than just an intention. We're coming back on Thursday. And we can use the present simple for a fixed timetabled event that can't be changed. We come back on Thursday. So let's unpick that a little bit further. We don't usually use present continuous for intentions. When our students, I think, often say things like, I'm being a writer when I'm older. I'm writing a book about it one day. And it just sounds wrong. And it sounds wrong because usually we don't use present continuous for intentions. Though having said that, as I've already said, something like I'm asking for a pay rise tomorrow, one could argue that that's an intention. But actually, I think what's going on there, in your head, you've already made some arrangements. Also, I think there's another kind of exception, which is a very, very strong intention. So, well, I'm definitely leaving home when I'm 18. A very strong intention, I think we can also use the present continuous. So we might want to introduce those at higher levels. But at lower levels, I think we want to get our students to avoid using present continuous for intentions. But of course, we can use present continuous for arrangements. We're coming back on Thursday. Whereas with be going to, we can use it for both for intentions and for arrangements. I'm going to be, or I'm going to be a writer when I'm older. That's an intention. I'm going to go shopping with Liz tomorrow. That's an arrangement. Now, interestingly, with this one, I've seen in some grammar books and course books, it say that we never use going to go in English. I have no idea where that came from. Personally, I just don't think that's correct. And I don't think the corpora bear that out. I think we frequently say things like, I'm going to go to bed soon. I don't see anything wrong with that at all. So I wouldn't encourage my students not to say going to go. So we can use be going to for both. So just to put that in a chart down at the bottom, we can use be going to for intentions and arrangements. Present continuous, we can't usually use for intentions, though there are those exceptions that I mentioned, but we can use it for arrangements. So what that means is we've got two different ways of talking about arrangements. I'm going to go shopping with Liz tomorrow. I'm going shopping with Liz tomorrow. Now, some course books and grammar books that I've seen do try and differentiate and even kind of say sometimes that one of those is right and one of those is wrong. And personally, I think they mean the same thing. I really don't think there is a fundamental difference in meaning. If there is something different between them, it is so subtle. I really don't think it's worth spending time on. I really don't. I'm going to go shopping. We're getting a pizza tonight. We're going to get a pizza tonight. They mean the same thing. They are just two different ways of ending up about talking about the future. So our students need to know that really, with something like this, expressing an arrangement before the moment of speaking, you can use either, and it doesn't make any difference. And once again, the key thing is, if they're speaking, they should use the short form. If they use the long form, it will sound unnatural, whether they choose present continuous or be going to. If they use the short form, then it will sound natural. To express offers, of course, we can use will, I'll help you. But of course, for offers in the question form, we use shall with I and we. Shall I help you with the washing up? Not will I help you. Interestingly, though, I think we can also use be going to. But here what that's doing, I think, is emphasizing that you made the decision in the past. You're not making it right now. So don't worry, I'm going to help you. Sounds perfectly fine. It does suggest that you already decided that in the past. You're not deciding right now. So there is a slight difference of emphasis, but we can use be going to. And we can't use present continuous, and we can't use present simple. For promises, once again, we use will, and this emphasizes the promise. And of course, when we're speaking, we should use the short form. So I promise I'll be there. Interestingly, we can use be going to, but it's emphasizing something slightly different. It's not emphasizing the promise, it's emphasizing the intention. So I promise I'm going to be there sounds totally fine. It's grammatically correct. It's just emphasizing something slightly different. So once again, when you have in some grammar books all these multiple choice exercises where will is correct and be going to is incorrect, actually, under certain circumstances, depending on what you want to emphasize, it isn't really wrong to use be going to. So if we've only got limited time in the classroom, far better to concentrate on the level of formality. We're speaking, so we should use the short form, not really so much on whether we use will or whether we use be going to. But of course, we don't use present continuous and we don't use present simple, so it is worth focusing on those aspects. To express suggestions, we can't use will, but note we can use shall. Shall we get a pizza tonight? Not, will we get a pizza tonight? We can't use be going to, we can't use present continuous, and we can use the negative question form of the present simple. Why don't we do something? Why don't we get a pizza tonight? To express requests for action, we can use will, and this is the one we always teach. Will you help me tomorrow? Asking someone to do something. Now, interestingly, we can also use be going to. Are you going to help me tomorrow? But actually what this is doing is it's trying to be a bit more polite by disguising your request for action. You don't actually want to say, will you? So you disguise it as a request for information. Are you going to help me tomorrow? What you might mean is, please help me, will you help me? But you're being more polite. You're being more subtle. So in those circumstances, we can use be going to, and we can also use present continuous. Are you helping me tomorrow? You don't want to say explicitly, will you help me tomorrow? So under certain circumstances, we can also use be going to and present continuous, but we can't use present simple. To express refusals, we can use will. Now, of course, when we're speaking, we're going to use the contracted form. No, I won't do your homework for you. I guess unless it's for real emphasis, no, I will not do your homework for you. Then we might use the full form. But we can also use be going to. No, I'm not going to do your homework for you. And we can also use present continuous. No, I'm not doing your homework for you. But we can't use present simple. So if we put all of those different functions into a chart, you'll see, if you look at will and you look at be going to, under certain circumstances, depending on the level of formality, depending on the emphasis, pretty much for all of those functions, apart from suggestions, we can use will or be going to. So it isn't only the function that's determining which one we use. It's something else. It's the level of formality, it's the emphasis, or perhaps it's the sentence structure. So function alone doesn't help our students. With present continuous, we don't use present continuous for intentions, but as I said, there are a few exceptions to that, which we should introduce at higher levels. And with present simple, there's only a couple of functions, really, main functions, that we use it for. So a few conclusions. There's the same table up at the top. I just rearranged it so it fits on the slide. And once again, don't feel you have to write all this down. In a couple of days, you'll get an email with the PDF in all of the slides from this webinar. So a few conclusions. The difference between will and be going to is rarely solely connected to function. If you look at that chart, for the functions, we can use will and be going to under certain circumstances for all of them pretty much. The difference is because of formality and register or emphasis. And so because of this, it's very, very important that our students consider the register. What are they doing? Are they talking to a friend? Are they writing an essay, which is an academic register? Are they writing a friendly letter? Are they writing an article? They always have to consider the register. So with academic writing, I think there's two things going on. Full forms, not short forms, and will is used far, far more often than be going to. And informal writing and informal speaking, or speaking generally, short forms. And be going to is used a lot more than will. Though, of course, we can use, under certain circumstances, the short form of will, ul, which we need to encourage our students to practice saying. So unless it's for emphasis or the question form, we rarely use the full form will, when we're speaking informally or semi-formally. It sounds really unnatural if our students say, I think she will like that present. Contracted, I think she'll like that present, it sounds fine. And to be honest, as I kind of said earlier, but I want to repeat this, whether they choose will or be going to, actually, it's probably going to sound okay as long as they use the short form or even present continuous under certain circumstances. We will not have time to visit the museum. Just doesn't sound right. It sounds unnatural. We won't have time. Just sounds fine. Or we're not going to have time. Or we aren't going to have time. They actually all sound fine. So, as I kind of just said here, the same as with be going to as with will. And with the negative, we are not going to sounds unnatural. We aren't going to, or we're not going to, or we aren't gonna, or we're not gonna. The present simple has very specific functions, which I think are relatively easy for students to understand. And I think course books and grammar books and teachers are very, very good at doing the present simple for talking about the future with students. So I'm not going to talk any more about that here. It's important that students understand the difference between intentions and arrangements, because there are many occasions where if students use the present continuous to talk about intentions, it just sounds wrong. But there are some exceptions, as I said earlier, which I think we should introduce at higher levels. The most important thing about the present continuous is that it's not usually used to describe intentions, but as I said, there are some exceptions. Now, back to future facts. I mentioned earlier that it's a problematic, troubling term, and this is why I think it is. I think we need to differentiate between future facts and arrangements. Have a look at this future fact. The sun will continue burning for at least 5 billion years. Now that uses will, that's formal. We can make it more informal by using be going to. The sun's gonna continue burning for at least 5 billion years. That's a future fact. Now let's compare that with an arrangement. They will land on Mars next April, that's formal. They're going to land on Mars next April, less formal. They're landing on Mars next April, that's fine as well. They land on Mars next April, that's also fine, because it's a fixed timetabled event. So if we put those two next to each other, we can see the grammatical difference. With what I've called an arrangement, we can use present continuous and present simple. But with what I've called a future fact, we can't use present continuous and we can't use present simple. Now, why? Would anyone like to suggest in the chat box what the difference is in, not grammatically, the difference, we can see the difference grammatically, but what's the difference that means that for those two future facts, we can't use present continuous and we can't use present simple? Lenka says the human factor. I think that's exactly right. That's totally correct. With the arrangement, there is a human factor. It's humans who have decided this. It's humans who can control this. With what I'm calling future facts, this is out of human control. And that seems to change the grammar. We can't use present continuous. We can't use present simple. So I think that's an important distinction for our students. So I think if it was up to me, I would reserve future fact for things that students can't have control over, that people don't have control over. People are asking, can they get this presentation and certificates? Yes, you can. You'll get an email in a couple of days with the PDF of all of the slides and your certificates. I've said this before, but let me just conclude by saying this again. Our students need to understand that sometimes they do have a real choice that doesn't affect meaning. We're going to the cinema tonight. We're going to go to the cinema tonight. There's really no fundamental difference between them. Are you going to get those shoes tomorrow? Are you getting those shoes tomorrow? They mean the same thing. They're just two different ways of ending up at the same meaning. And conclusion 8, as we said right at the start, as well as understanding that we don't use will in the if clause of a first conditional, apart from a couple of exceptions, our students do need to know that we can use be going to. And this is something that for some strange reason rarely appears in course books and grammar books, but it's very, very common in spoken English. Well, if you're going to cook dinner, I'll do the washing up. We can't use will in the if clause, but we can use be going to. Conclusion 9, our students need to know that we can use be going to as well as will in the future perfect and future continuous. Now, I haven't really mentioned the future perfect and future continuous in this session. I'm afraid we don't really have time for that. Maybe I'll come back another day and we'll talk about those. But it is interesting that a lot of course books and grammar books say the future perfect is will have done and the future continuous is will be doing. But actually that isn't, of course that's true, but they can be other things because it can also be going to. I'll have finished is future perfect, but I'm going to have finished is also future perfect. We can use be going to as well as will. We'll be flying, future continuous. We're going to be flying, future continuous. It isn't always with will. Sometimes it's with be going to as well. So just for a couple of minutes, how can we best teach expressing future time in the classroom? I think we need to stop saying it's always a straight choice in terms of function. Function is important. Students need to understand that there are different functions, but if we solely focus on function, we miss out some of the other key elements, such as formality and emphasis. And I think we've got to be very careful what we ask our students to contrast. There are so many exercises, multiple choice exercises, where there's one correct answer. But in fact, it's very difficult from the context to work out whether the other options under certain circumstances could be right or not. So where possible, I think it's good to get away from these multiple choice where there's only one correct answer. And we're asking students to contrast things that under certain circumstances might well be right. So what kind of things should we be doing? Well, this kind of thing, for example, we give students sentences or extracts from newspapers or from academic writing, which use formal language. So the 2020 Olympics will be held in Tokyo. But then they ask and answer questions about it, and because they're speaking, they use more informal forms. So where are they going to hold the 2020 Olympics? They're going to hold them in Tokyo. Not they will hold them in Tokyo. They're going to hold them in Tokyo, or perhaps they'll hold them using the short form, but not the full form, because that would be formal. And I've got a few more examples there. I don't want to look at them in detail, but the key point is we're encouraging students to recognize that more than one answer is correct. Under certain circumstances, in exercise 3 here, it could be we're going to meet, we're meeting, we'll meet, we meet, etc. So we're encouraging students to recognize that more than one answer may be correct depending on the circumstance. And then we have a second stage where we discuss the context, we discuss the circumstance, we discuss the level of formality. Here in exercise 1, or in exercise 2, 2D, 2A, term starts on the 10th of January using the present simple. Where would we see the present simple? Who might use that? Might that, for example, be in a letter from a head teacher to the parents? It's a timetabled, fixed event. Whereas term starting on 10th of January might be something that a child says to the parent. And we actually discuss those differences in the classroom, rather than in the traditional way of this is right, this is wrong. So my time is up. That's more than 45 minutes. There's a couple more examples on the PDF for you to look at. There's a few references right at the end of the PDF as well. I hope you found that useful. Thank you very, very much for coming. 425 people are in the room as we speak. 426. Someone's just come in. Person who's just come in, I'm afraid you've missed it, but you will be able to get the PDF in a couple of days. So thank you all very, very much for coming. We've probably got a couple of minutes for questions, but I'll go back now to Federica. Sorry, Federica. I'll go back to Federica and she can monitor all of that aspect.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. It was a great session. It was absolutely brilliant. And as Malcolm said, in case you have any questions, just type them in the chat box and I'll make sure that Malcolm can answer them. So one question that did come up in the meantime was, is there a massive difference between American English and British English in terms of how the future is used? If there is, if you can give us, just one example in case there is.
That's a very good question. And I wouldn't claim to be an expert on American English. Well, to be honest, I don't claim to be an expert in anything. But I am a native speaker of English, so I'm far more comfortable with British English. To be honest, I can't think of a major difference right now. There are certainly differences in conditionals. In the if clauses of conditionals, there are differences, and in the result clauses of conditions, but not particularly connected to generally talking about the future. I can't think of one offhand. I think on the whole, there are far more similarities than differences. Any other questions?
That's great, thank you. Another question that we got was, can we just say that sometimes context is the main factor to decide whether we should use formality or formality? I mean,
absolutely, absolutely. Context is fundamental. Context is things like the level of formality. What's being emphasized? Without context, actually, generally, it's impossible to decide which one to use. Context is the only way that we can make that choice. So totally.
And then another question that I'm not sure was, in fact, a question, no, I'm joking, was, should we get pizza tonight? So is that a way to express intention, and does that count as future in this context? Like,
well, did you say, shall we get a pizza tonight?
Should we get pizza tonight?
Right, yes,
like,
that's just
that
it does. It's talking about tonight. That's clearly talking about the future. If there is a difference between should we get a pizza tonight and shall we get a pizza tonight, in terms of making a suggestion, it's a little bit more hypothetical. And so it makes it a little bit formal, a little bit more formal, and a little bit less of a suggestion. But it's absolutely grammatically correct. It's kind of asking the other person's opinion a bit more than shall. So it's a bit more polite, a bit more formal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it makes sense to the people that asked it as well. So thank you so much, Malcolm. It was absolutely amazing.